So this will be kind of a short discussion on cracks at notches. We've talked about stress concentrations already, and we've talked about what the stress field would look like at a typical stress concentration, such as a plate with a hole that I have drawn in here. In this example, the stress at the edge of the hole is higher than what we have in the far field. It's a very small hole and a very large plate. The stress concentration factor tends toward 3. We have a finite width plate. It can be a little bit less depending on how the nominal section is defined. But this stress tapers off quite quickly at the beginning and eventually comes to a steady state value around what the far field stress is at. So this sketch right here would be the value of the stress in the axial direction, accounting for the local behavior at the edge of the hole as it moves off in this direction. Well, if we were to have a crack that is near the edge of the hole, then the local stress on the crack can be influenced by this kind of overall stress concentration behavior. So let me draw maybe one side of this. And we have a relatively small crack that we might see that comes away from this notch. Now, in this perspective, this crack is fairly small in comparison to the other dimensions in this picture, and it is heavily influenced by the local stress near this stress concentration. When we look at it this way, this looks like a crack with a stress field where we have the local stress being the far field stress on this crack. So we can say something like small cracks are heavily influenced by the stress concentration factor or notch stress field. What do we mean by small? Well, it's the right dimension that this works out to be heavily influenced by the notch stress field. Now, if you have larger cracks, so I'll draw the hole, and perhaps there's a crack over here and a crack over here, and these are kind of large now in comparison to the dimensions of this. Well, we really don't have a situation where the crack is influenced so much by the local stress field, and in fact the stress concentration factor itself, or the lack of material or this hole, can also tend to influence this. So if we think of a center cracked plate of crack length 2A, well, the 2A would encompass the missing material from the hole and the crack from both sides. All right, so I'm going to say large cracks can act like they are long and incorporate the notch dimensions. So that's the basic idea with that. Let me save this page and we'll just write down a couple other notes. And so based on what we've just talked about, if we were to look at the growth rate of cracks near notches, they may look a little peculiar. They may look a little bit funny. So we'll plot our log DADN log delta K plot. Where we might see something that looks like this if we were looking at a compact tension specimen or other standard type specimen. But we also could find near notches some behavior that's kind of like this, where it may initiate a little bit faster at a smaller delta K, Or we might even see behavior where it kind of decelerates and hooks back up. And all these things can be due to the influence of that local notch or stress concentration stress field. So those are the main points that I wanted to make about cracks near stress concentrations. And in cyclic loading, we've talked about how we can develop residual stress fields, and that can affect our delta K effective and our K open as well. One more slide for that. Okay, so during loading, at the stress concentration, you may have, for cyclic loading, an introduction of compressive residual stresses, maybe a little bit more easily than with just a crack. So if we put these compressive residual stresses kind of superimposed on here, the crack has to go through this field where we have this reversed plasticity and compressive stresses, and so that's why we can get this deceleration until it gets out of that zone of influence, and then we get back to more of a normal crack length, and by that time it may look like the actual crack size and the size of the notch as well. So all these things can kind of work together. All right, with that, I think that's enough for what I wanted to talk about with cracks coming from notches.